Trials of Mana, or originally known as Seiken Densetsu 3, was sadly a Japan-only release in the Mana franchise. It was Secret of Mana's direct sequel, building upon many of its concepts and ideas. This was one of the classic tragic cases of no export for you, Westerners. It was only accessible via, less than legal means, but nevertheless, it was a cult classic in the emulation scene, and often cited as a hidden gem and masterpiece of the SNES. Truly, it is a special title. Likewise, the other subject of this video, FF7, is famous for a similar reason. FF7 being, a system definer on the PlayStation 1. But FF7 is too big to really dig into, so the focus will just be on the remake itself. I'm afraid to touch FF7 in any serious capacity, but its remake is its own animal, and it's one, despite not being finished, is somehow one I can have an easier time just getting a read of than I, expected when I first started this project. Some might ask, what inspired this little video? Both titles came out roughly around the same time period. FF7 Remake came around April 10th, 2020, while Trials of Mana came out April 24th, 2020. So you can see that JRPG fans weren't exactly starved for quality titles around this time period. But I, being not so well endowed financially, could not afford to play either of these two titles upon release. So I relied quite heavily on Sony's nice little new subscription service to pay for these games. And play for these games, and it definitely paid off as my mind sat on this for quite a while, so much so that I decided to make this my first official YouTube video, or video essay, or whatever this will be. FF7 Remake is a fundamentally transversive and different title in nature to its original. What could be said about FF7 that hasn't been said before? Its legacy and name speaks for itself, but the question of its intended direction in the remake will always hang over the remake project until its end. Why didn't we just get the same game with improved visuals and presentation? FF7 Remake is a more transversive and it's doing everything possible to deviate from the original title. It's not even the same story or game mechanically as the original was. They didn't even bother to change genres or reimagine the gameplay. It was a total rehaul from the bottom up, with all the trappings and inclusions of modernity within the city of Midgar. FF7 Remake is a divisive title for sure. Fans and detractors are split on the title. Even someone like me who enjoyed it is still fundamentally torn on this title. Yes, the original exists and is accessible, but what will this remake do for the original's legacy? As it stands, FF7 Remake is doing its own thing under the guise of the world of FF7. Thematically and at its core, what is this game doing with the original's characters? Preserving and honoring them? Well, some can't agree. I, for one, can say it's been excellent at one thing, and that's fan service. We're seeing more interactions and more moments of beloved characters, and it's fun, genuinely speaking. It's enjoyable, and some of it does have substance and real feelings of weighing in on some of the lines of dialogue. FF7's setting has left behind its original intent, and design has become a beast of its own design. Its own popularity being its own undoing. Ironically, we are so far removed from the original schizo-kabbalistic roots of the original. The Sephiroth of the original has nothing in common with the Sephiroth of today, the Sephiroth as we know it. But in several respects, we're getting the full anti-capitalist environmental message in full force, and it's taking up more focus, which I do think is a good thing. People forget that all these heavy political anti-authoritarian themes were hard-baked into Final Fantasy. It wasn't just about saving the world on an existential level. To see these themes preserved and expanded upon is a net positive. A lot of Western fans might be surprised by the values and political leanings of the influence of these older JRPGs. I know I've been as of late. It's really changed my perception of these legacy titles. In some respects, I can't love them anymore. This is a topic that quite frankly deserves its own video, and I'm going to stop here. But one can see how deep this rabbit hole can go. FF7 Remake's biggest change, ironically, has little to do with what both remakes did change. The gameplay, ironically, wasn't the biggest change at its core. Whether or not it was turn-based or not didn't really matter, as the original story and setting remained the same. As I remember, the original debate surrounding the remake focused mostly on the gameplay, rather than what ended up being the biggest change of all. Trials, though, is straight up the same game as its original. Its world and layout is the exact same. The plot and its rudimentary beats are the same as the original, with some minor additions. Even the flags to trigger plot progression are literally the same. It's the same set of NPCs you have to talk to trigger events. I was running around confused to why I had to talk to random NPCs with advice that was somewhat relevant when I had objective markers, not realizing that it was necessary to talk to NPCs in the original to figure out what to do next within the game. The original encouraged exploration to learn more about the world and align the player to their next objective. But with objective markers, that spirit is somewhat dead now. You can kind of just breeze through things like a checklist without really becoming immersed and seriously exploring beyond just hunting for chests and pickups. But granted, you can stop yourself and smell the roses anytime you'd like, and we here believe options are always a good thing. Room for the new without crowding out the old are both present here. Though it would be dishonest not to mention Trials' new post-game content, but it's just a nice bonus that is pretty normal for most RPGs. Trials is a refreshingly standard complete game, and I mean that in a good way. It feels nice having a complete package with no extra fillings. To some it may feel empty, but Trials with its extra content came from the replayability of the original. Other than mild updates to the perspective, upgrading exploration, and combat, Trials is still a brawling action RPG. One not too far removed from its original legacy, the change to the third-person perspective feels like a natural evolution. This format could be adapted simply into a brand new mana title, and it'd be right at home with its predecessors. Some could be forgiven for thinking of it as generic, not understanding it was a product of the time. But it still feels like a mana game, if not a bit streamlined in several respects. Item upgrading was most notably simplified in this game. The entire game could be blazed through in like 20 hours, maybe even less, thanks to the streamlining and extra features. Not to mention, features like skipping cutscenes and dialogue. These typical quality of life features really do slim things down. Trials of Mana is as faithful as a remake can be, and in turn is preserving the legacy of the original instead of just it merely being an update or a different direction. It merely just streamlines and enhances a solid core of a game for contemporary audiences. Trials of Mana believed that it was already a solid title and it just needed to be presented as it was with some obvious but nevertheless appreciated quality of life improvements. A post-game as well as with new final tier classes was included, and it doesn't feel too tacked on. It's a natural part of the experience, similar to most post games for RPGs. For Pokemon, take Pokemon for example. You know, making a super boss and certain content less limited are all positives and a natural thing to have. These are just things that should have been the way they were. A point to mention, of course, is the music. The Trials Remake OST is virtually the same, and the original is selectable if you feel like it. I remember I was playing FF10 for the Vita, and that version only had the remastered OST. This was fixed in the later ports, you know, you could change between the old and new OST, but the lack of options often stinks for people. And it did for me at the time. It's not a deal breaker, but it suggests a lack of care from the developer. But if you listen to some of the tracks, they are essentially the same tracks. This is one of the best remix soundtracks I've ever heard. It took the original 16-beat OST and managed to keep the same retro sort of vibe and mood with the tracks, and these, well, tracks are just as catchy as ever. This should be an example of how to do a proper remixing / orchestration for an older soundtrack. Hiroki Kikuta, his masterful work, was debatably enhanced in this. This OST was magical then, and it's still creating that wonderful feel today. After listening to both back and back, I could hear new things or become aware of nuances and aspects of the original OST that I didn't even notice. The remake OST is so good that it enhances and improves upon aspects of the original, and better highlights, various aspects of the song. Sorry, music analysis isn't my specialty, but I really do have a passion for this. Apologies for my mediocre musical analysis. I'll try to learn music theory one of these days, but until then, just forgive a layman trying to have some sort of nuance in regards to his opinions for music in his video games. One major reason for why it has that magic, is that Kikuta, the original composer, had returned for the remake to supervise the 4 different composers who handle the orchestration of the Trials OST. The vision and the feel of the original is preserved and enhanced, and I'm a strange kind of purist. I prefer faithfulness and often chafe against rearrangements or remixes of tracks. It's not even getting into games themselves. I couldn't ever really explain why, but I just would typically cringe when I would hear something that was not familiar, or I just maybe thought it sounded better the way it was before. A completely arbitrary and emotional response, but it's one that I have. Some say that I might arbitrarily prefer or elevate the original, and that I may be biased against new tracks through, the typical way of a rose-tinted glasses. This could be true, but I can appreciate the potential of the new, and in contrast to compare, when looking at Final Fantasy, one can see a complex history in regards to its music. Like Mana, a lot of these old tracks have got a new splash of fresh paint, and I've always had mixed opinions. I've always preferred the originals, typically. I won't deny it. I am rather biased in that manner. But maybe there's something special about the synthesizers or the sound fonts of those eras. Something about the simplicity and just the fact that they only had that one soundboard and they just had to make it work. Those limitations of hardware has forced a lot of creators to get really creative and maximize what they had and to make the best of whatever they had. Something that was, whether intended or not, made art. And while I talk about this sort of abstract magic, there is a kind of magic to that sound that feeling endows, that nostalgia, whether firsthand or not, is still powerful. And it's undercut through both of these remakes. That nostalgia, even if it's secondhand, is something that these developers are banking on, invoking to capture us, the audience. Now to clarify, FF7 Remake's OST is phenomenal, truly amazing. I haven't heard so much variety in OST in, well, just, I don't think in a while. All the new tracks really hit it out of the park, and I find myself listening to them more than the familiar tracks, you know, the remixes. And this isn't me even getting into the remix tracks, which despite my general opinions on remixes sound great. I can tell it's an homage to, and I can appreciate how it fits in with within the game. There's a little bit of that sprinkle of that magic, right? I keep on referring to this magic, but it's there, especially on the iconic opening track. I want to say that it's the logical progression of that cinema-like feel that the original was trying to portray, which sadly is not included, but considering that it's just a brand new experience entirely, I wasn't just expecting the original soundtrack just lying around somewhere to just put in there. The new OST has more than enough to really dive into and appreciate, and one can say that FF7 Remake captures the tone of the original very well. The oppressive industrial atmosphere mixed in with a strangely modern yet steampunk feel. There's still a great picture of the beauty contrasting that harshness that's even more stark, like at Aerith's home or at the church, funnily both involving Aerith. At first, it seemed to me that the bombing run and subsequent events followed along pretty faithfully, fleshing out details as we went until new additions came along, which fit in well enough, but as time went on in the game, you could tell they weren't just extra content, but new plot threads, like the soldier fight in one of the upper districts. I don't want to say much else. But we're not going to get into the finale. That, in hindsight, really did stick out as a sore thumb, but maybe that was the point. Features-wise, the games keep a tight pack. FF7 Remake dallies due to new content, but these are optional, so it's on you if you want to stay for a bit and just stray off to the side. It's not that rapid-fire action-packed romp from Midgar through the original bit. It's more meditative at times. Trials, on the other hand, offers no rooms for straying. It's just the plot as it was, with some voice acting here or there, which, by the way, is more comedic than anything, especially with the English dub. They really kept in Charlotte's verbal tick, and you either love it or hate it. It's comedy, nevertheless. But it would be remiss of me not to mention the loss of a defining feature of Secret and of Trials, and that is the multiplayer mode, which is definitely a shame. It's a very unique feature amongst its peers and in the genre, but it was removed. Based on the style of game, it would be difficult to implement in my opinion, because frankly, it is a cheap remake. It's not even deniable. It's just something you can get the feeling of the whole thing being held up by duct tape or string code. I feel like I'm playing Halo 2 again. What is a remake supposed to be, and which is the best remake? Trials just didn't happen in a vacuum, as I've been talking about it. In reality, it was a response to an actually failed remake. Some might dispute this, but the remake of Secret of Mana was undeniably a messy one, even if one considers it a functional remake. No doubts it was a step down from the original, even though the gameplay is functionally the same. The cheap visuals that failed to preserve the artistry of the original's visuals, the soundtrack's general direction being all over the place due to 4 different composers, in contrast to Trials. So Square, seeing the mixed reception of the Secret of Mana remake, decided to pivot and try a different route with the Trials remake. Instead of a simultaneously cheap and quick rush job remake, they decided to put some measure of care into the Trials remake, taking feedback into account. Plus, this was also potentially motivated by the fact that the Mana series had a collection in 2017, and the Secret remake motivated a greater push to finally bring Trials to the West for the first time. So the demand was clearly there, and the team behind the project wanted to push ahead with it. Because it was a new experience, they wanted it to be a fresh experience for the overseas audience. Though I've been praising the game as a remake, it's technically a reimagining like FF7, actually, and it was intended to be like that, but it just came out as a remake. People still can't figure out what is a remake and what makes it good. I, for one, think the rhetoric and nature of the question is something that we still haven't figured out yet. Or maybe we do and I just don't know. We all know what a cheap or bad game looks like, but that isn't always the problem here. really. The issue is of fidelity to an original title's vision and intent. Portray it as better or as it was in its original best format. But even a different vision and intent is still considered grounds for a remake. Gamers often have a poor literacy of media and history, so they often don't know what a remake. They don't know that reimaginings are remakes in their own manner. Gamers often have a poor literacy of media and history, so they don't know that reimaginings are remakes in their own way. Movies and books have fantastic examples of this dichotomy in action. The book-to-movie pipeline is very real, and so pervasive. I'm going to say perverse. Several of my friends didn't even know that American Psycho was first a novel before becoming a meme flick. The hit DreamWorks film Shark Tale was a reimagining of The Godfather. Let that sink in a little bit. Remakes are not above what FF7 is doing, and in fact, it might just been going on earlier than we even imagined. We just assume an upgrade in visuals, not considering that there's more on the table to do. But here's the question then. Is what either of these two games doing from the originals an improvement, or in my opinion, the most important aspect, taking the heart of the original and doing something great with it? Based on the previously established logic, which of the two is the better title? Honestly, maybe due to how fresh Trials was when I played it compared to FF7 Remake, I just think that Trials is the better game. Some might find this mad and say that you're mad, man. FF7, though, is undeniably more expensive and, well, a higher quality title. FF7 killed it by reimagining, well, I shouldn't say they killed it. They killed it in the sense that they knocked it out of the park by presenting the city of Midgar in a highly detailed manner, very high fidelity. Trials, like I had admitted before, was a cheaper product, and it does show. Content-wise, it's a more complete game, and content-wise, it's a more complete game, and FF7, though a complete game, its own right, felt like a stepping stone, or more like a prototype for a future project. There's 2 more remake titles coming out soon, and the plot direction was a retail hijacked by extra canonical details, and just a new plot line entirely. It's not a complete package in my mind. It's more like a test run, while Trials just feels like a culmination and refinement of previous games. A successful triumph in a series instead of just treading new ground. FF7's plot could be debated if it was good or not, relying on a previously established universe for most of its heavy characterization, this video was more stacked in favor of Trials of Mana, probably because I played it recently, and frankly, my opinion of FF7 Remake soured a bit after the fact. But I did give it a play/watch through this video. Trials of Mana did really charm me that much that I had to just get something out there to give it more love and appreciation, because FF7 Remake doesn't need the help in my opinion. Trials is the one who really needs the helping hand. Secret and Trials feel like a duology more than a trilogy. And Secret is it's a well-known classic, but I kind of like Trials too. And I want that to be a classic too, recognized by everyone. I believe it is in Japan, but unfortunately, as a victim of no export syndrome, it never got a chance to shine. Hopefully in my next video, I can explain some of my thoughts that I left out because, the videos need to have FF7 as a frame of comparison. Having a hard mode is a highlight experience for hardcore players, and I'd have to praise much of it for, just having it within the game. So it'd be unfair for me to not mention that experience. But the only problem is I was just too much of a casual to beat it myself. There's something I do adore about the humbleness of Trials' scope and vision. It just wanted to do the right by the original and succeeded, maybe not perfectly, but it's a solid title. Can't look at it and say it's bad. Like any child following its predecessor, it just needs to succeed and stand on its own and not do much else. Surpassing the predecessor isn't required, and that's okay. FF7, though, on the other hand, promises a lot off the back of a greater work, and frankly, despite it going its own way and carving its own path, throwing off the past and its legacy and trappings of tradition and the past to supposedly change the paradigm or tread new ground. Though, like many people I've seen and will see in the future who, just think like this, with all that freedom in the world, and they still didn't accomplish much or change anything. And if anything, they fall down traps of their own making and really end up failing to make something even satisfactory in their efforts. And I just watch on, just from the distance, thinking to myself, what was the whole point of this in the end? It simultaneously clutches onto the prestige of the original to stay afloat and justify itself while superfluously saying it will honor the original while defacing it and cobbling together something that is supposedly new from just its bits and pieces. I enjoyed my time with FF7 Remake, but to me, it's only like a non-canon omake at the end of a manga. Something enjoyable, but is just kind of forgettable fluff in the end. This video was inspired by many things actually. First, it was the fact that when I was playing the game for the first time, I was blown away by this 2-decade-old game. Yeah, I know it's a remake and not the original, but the remake is so faithful. The last faithful remake that I played that really sticks out of my mind immediately was the Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes. That was a super faithful remake if I've ever seen one, you know. One which also improved and expanded upon the content suite and experience of the original by a significant degree. Though probably more so than Trails itself. Although a shame what happened to later Pokemon remakes. Even as a slightly scuffed but nevertheless charming title, that was one of the few games that I've enjoyed playing recently. Though I haven't completely finished playing the original, it is something that I will rectify soon enough. I think games should look into the methodology behind the Trials remake and their remakes, because it's inevitable that we're going to get more remakes, and yet these remakes are often mediocre or missing the point. There are plenty mid to mediocre remakes out there, far too many to count, though a case could be made that games could consider the path of FF7 remake, which is to say, it could be a whole new trend in games. Reimagining just disguised as remakes. I wouldn't mind that sort of style of game, provided that they're of course quality titles. Though I decried the new, I cannot help desire to see new stories, even if they'll be disappointing to me, because there's something within anyone really living, and that's the hope for a new seed to grow into another tree of its own standing. Afternotes. I had originally intended on 3 videos on Trials of Mana, but halfway through the scripting of this video, it just straight up turned into a soft review of Trials of Mana and FF7 Remake, while being somewhat of a comparison. Unexpectedly, in this self-created hell I've made, I may have killed one of those 3 videos on Trials, but time will tell. I'm rather new to this whole video creation process, and well, scripting is a struggle for me, just frankly speaking. But nevertheless, I really enjoyed this process of creating a video. I consider this my first true worthwhile video and project worth sharing.